Just a few weeks ago, Magnus Carlsen was in a luxury spa resort in Germany, playing chess against the world's best. Today, he's here, in a school gym on the outskirts of Oslo, facing an opponent he hasn't played in a decade, his former coach, Simen Agdestein. The history between Magnus Carlsen and Simen Agdestein runs deep. In 2005, a teenage Magnus fought his former coach for the Norwegian Championship, only to fall short in a grueling 8-game tiebreak. A year later, he got his revenge, defeating Simen in yet another tiebreak to claim his first national title. Since then, Magnus has climbed to the top of the chess world, but their paths crossed again in Norway Chess in 2014, where this time, Magnus came out on top. Now, over a decade later, they meet yet again.
Just playing the games is, like, regardless of setting, it's nerve-wracking. There's always something going on at team events, but most of all, playing in these, I think I'm just like a little bit more nervous than usual.
So let's jump in. Simen Agdestein with the white pieces, Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces in the Eliteserien, the Norwegian Team Championship. The game started with d4. Simen tends to play this move, and he has done throughout his very successful career. Magnus replied by bringing his knight out, and by transposition we get to a Queen's Gambit declined. And it's here, Queen's Gambit declined is because Magnus has left the tension between these pawns. He hasn't, for example, captured on the c4 square, which would be the Queen's Gambit accepted. And now Magnus plays a move that he hasn't employed too much throughout his career, trying to surprise Simen as early as possible. He brings his knight out to d7. This is one of many possible moves for black in that position. It was also possible to bring the bishop out one square, to bring it out to b4, the Rogozin defense. Variety of ways for Magnus to play, but he tries to keep the tension, and the pawn structure that arises after a capture in the center is known as the Carlsbad structure, one of the pawn structures in chess that Magnus Carlsen thrives in the most. This can arise from a variety of different openings, but especially the Queen's Gambit declined. And here Magnus plays a very surprising move. He brings his knight off to b6, off to the side of the board, maybe aiming to jump in a bit later, but more importantly, freeing up his bishop on this diagonal. Simen decides to bring his queen out, a very logical move. The queen on c2 stops the black bishop from using the important f5 square, its most desirable post. Magnus now hunts down Simen's bishop, the dark square bishop, forced to retreat, or does it? It actually steps forward into the center of the board and provoking Magnus into playing this move, f6, which tends to be very weakening, as we see a bit later on. Yes, it forces the bishop back to a square it can soon be captured. Magnus will soon get the bishop pair, but Magnus now behind in development, taking big risks early in the game. Remember, he's a big rating favorite. He needs to try and win, so imbalancing things early on is a decent strategy. Here, just a few developing moves now, both sides bringing out their bishops. The white bishop and queen battery is very threatening here, very ominous on the diagonal, forcing Magnus to again push a pawn on the king side. Not something he really wants to do, but necessary here. And both sides continue to develop nicely. Here, Magnus castles. You might be wondering what happens if there's a sacrifice. Bishop takes pawn. This looks very promising for white until you realize that knights are great defenders and black can retreat. The knight on g7 covers all threats. Next move, the white queen will be evicted, either with the black bishop or by the threat of a queen exchange, and there's not quite enough compensation. So Simen is forced to play very positionally here. He brings his knight over to the queen side. These knights do kind of give away the fact that he wants to castle on this flank. The knights will protect their king. Magnus continues to try and improve his pieces. We see an exchange, very risky from Magnus, as we mentioned, opening up the h-file towards the black king, but he feels that he has everything covered. Now, the black pieces, the black side has the bishop pair. We watch that come into effect a bit later on. Pawn moves, the knight jumps in, Magnus tries to keep the tension, but suddenly there's nothing to do simply. Magnus here lacking a plan, maybe feeling a bit frustrated, spending a lot of time on the clock, decides knight takes knight is the best remedy, the best way forward. He needs to open up his position. Black is very cramped here. Magnus feeling the heat, the lack of space, so deciding to try and trade pieces. And Simen now playing a very brave move. The safer one would be to play knight takes knight here to trade off pieces, bring the knight towards the center. Instead, he captures with a pawn. And look at how this pawn, protected by the white knight, totally clamps down on one flank. The pawn and the knight combined stop black from breaking out. There are no pawn breaks on the queen side. And yes, this knight is on the rim, but it's far from dim right now. Magnus still struggling for a plan. And look how, after white castles, he's completely controlling the queen side, Simen Agdestein. The rook prevents any breaks in the center. The knight prevents any breaks on the other side of the board, forcing Magnus to play on the side where he's a bit weaker, opening up his own king here, Magnus Carlsen. The black king feeling the heat, and bishop to d3, reminding Magnus that this diagonal is a bit of a danger for him. Pawn takes pawn, for example, would be suicidal in this position. Bishop takes pawn would be the answer, and you cannot take it, as this would end in checkmate. The white queen, the white rook, teaming up to deliver the killer blow. So Magnus needs to keep this diagonal closed. He brought his queen out. Another pawn flies forward. Magnus brings his rook across, at least trying to go for piece coordination, if nothing else. And now Simen jumping in with his rook. It was clear that at this point, the more experienced player was feeling very confident, trying to go for an attack against Magnus's king. Magnus in full defense mode, shifts his rook up to defend the weak pawn on h7. Another rook slides across, doubling on this h-file now. The black bishop adopts a defensive post, kicking away white's rook. And it was here in this position, after 26 moves, that finally the first real mistake was made by Simen Agdestein. The best move would have been to keep the tension, to do nothing, to just shuffle the king into the corner. It tends to be a good idea in general, if you castle on the queen side, to push your king slightly closer to safety. The idea here being that where it currently stands, this pawn, the backward pawn on e3, would always fall with a check. So getting out of that check often means the tactics work in white's favor a bit later. Simen, though, blocking things up on the king side, blocking up his own attack, gave Magnus now a huge opportunity. Magnus did not hesitate. He blew open the center. He sacrificed a pawn temporarily in order to free up this clump of pieces here. The bishops, they thrive with open diagonals, so this pawn sacrifice allows Magnus to get those open lines. He shuffles his queen across now. This pawn is dropping, the rook is coming, the bishop might come to regain the pawn. Simen decided one last hurrah, one last attempt to attack, but Magnus has locked down that side of the board. He now took this pawn. There's nothing to be done here. Simply the rook controls everything. The black king is safe enough, while the other side of the board suddenly turning in Magnus's favor. One variation that looked very tempting and might have been Simen's plan was to push this pawn forward. But after a capture, yes, it's a check. Magnus, though, has that square covered. He would have given up his queen now for two rooks. And a bit of counting shows that Magnus would have been up two rooks and a pawn just for white's queen. This would have been advantage Magnus Carlsen. Instead, Simen tried a different approach. No attack anymore. He tries to defend, but a check, forcing the white king into the corner, and now Magnus again ups the pressure. This is a nasty looking pin, forcing the decisive mistake. A second mistake from Simen Agdestein, not bringing his knight forward as he should have done, instead retreating his rook. This move given question marks by the computer because it's simply too passive. Defense is not the best form of attack here, and Magnus now doubling up his rooks. This tips white over the edge. The whole defensive idea for Simen was to bring his rook across, allowing the white bishop to drop, but getting the black bishop in return. But he might have missed that Magnus Carlsen, at the end, after the queen exchange, had this double attack. It looks simple once you see it, but you had to see it from a few moves away. He attacks the knight on the edge of the board, finally kicking that piece away, and attacks a loose pawn. And we all know Magnus Carlsen, the king of endgames. He closes things out really nicely here. He wins a pawn, keeps things nice and safe now, keeps his king protected. And a few moves later, we see him do the damage. He forces the white knight away from the defense of the c5 pawn with a check. He forces the white king back. Now he drops back with his rook, and Simen had nothing to do here. It's not just the fact that he's a pawn down, he's also facing the greatest endgame player of all time. The c5 pawn drops. We see an exchange of rooks. The black king steps forward. Yes, this pawn drops on the edge of the board, but in this position, after 48 moves, the black bishop now dominating this white knight on the edge of the board, and Magnus with an extra pawn about to start running towards promotion. This is where Simen Agdestein resigned. Magnus took the win.
There were certainly moments where it was feeling quite hairy. I was hesitating quite a lot and spending a lot of time, but I think ultimately I managed to keep things like more or less under control. he was definitely not worse at certain times, but I never felt like he had something big, and it felt that I would always have very good counter chances. And the main strength of my position is that his knight is really, really far from the action. So I think there was one specific moment where I thought he may have been able to bring his knight back to some effect, but I don't remember exactly what it was. But at that time, I was a bit, certainly a bit nervous. At other times, I was nervous as well, but I did feel that my position was usually okay. He's a very good fighter in general, so he's kind of hard to feel completely safe against him. Obviously, from way back in the day, I know some of his tendencies, so I was certainly keeping that in mind. But it feels alright to be back to the old days a little bit.